I've always had a deep connection with my family, and my relationship with Aunt Amanda was no exception. She wasn't just my aunt. She was the kind of person who commanded attention when she entered a room. Amanda had a grace and poise that drew you in. At 40, she was still stunning. Her dark hair was always well kept, and her eyes sparkled with an intelligence and mystery that intrigued me. Her beauty hadn't faded with age. In fact, it had only deepened, taking on a more refined allure that I found fascinating. Growing up, Amanda was someone I always admired. She was self-assured, successful in her career, and had an aura of control that I found impressive. Despite her sophistication, there was a warmth in her that made her approachable. I looked up to her, and our relationship was always a mix of admiration and respect. She wasn't just family. She was a mentor, someone I could turn to for guidance. Our conversations were always insightful, and she had a way of making even the most trivial matters seem important. I was 20, a young man still figuring out who I was and what I wanted out of life. At times, I felt like I was still a kid in the eyes of my family, constantly being looked after and protected. My life was in a phase of transition, leaving behind the comfort of my childhood and trying to step into adulthood. I was exploring what it meant to be independent, to forge my own path. But at the same time, there was a part of me that felt like I was missing something that could give me the answers I was searching for. Amanda had always been there, but recently, something about her had begun to shift in a way I couldn't quite explain. I noticed subtle changes in her behavior, things that seemed out of place. She wasn't as present during family gatherings, and when she did show up, she appeared distracted, her mind elsewhere. There was a coldness about her that I hadn't noticed before, a distance that made me uneasy. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I never dared to confront her about it. It wasn't just her that had changed. I found myself becoming more aware of how I felt around her. I caught myself looking at her differently on several occasions, more intensely than I had ever allowed myself to before. It wasn't anything obvious, just fleeting moments when our eyes would meet, and a strange feeling would settle in the pit of my stomach. I tried to push those thoughts away, telling myself it was just my imagination, a passing phase. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the pull she had on me. Our interactions started to feel different too. There were moments when she would linger a little too long in a conversation, or I would catch her glancing at me from across the room, her gaze lingering just a second longer than necessary. I was beginning to sense a change in the dynamic between us, one that I couldn't explain but that I couldn't deny either. The summer was beginning to wind down, and I was spending more time at my parents' house than I usually did. Amanda had come over to visit more often lately, and with each passing day, I felt like I was drawn to her in a way that was becoming harder to ignore. My family didn't notice the subtle tension that seemed to hang between us, but I felt it. Every time she smiled at me, every time our hands brushed as we passed each other in the kitchen. It was as if the world had shifted, and we were suddenly caught in this unspoken tension that neither of us knew how to navigate. One evening, after a family dinner, I found myself alone with her in the living room. The others had retired to bed, and the house was quiet. Amanda was sitting on the couch, her legs tucked underneath her as she read a book. I stood by the door, watching her for a moment, uncertain of what to do next. She looked up at me, and for a brief second, I saw something flicker in her eyes, something that made my heart race. It was a strange feeling, almost as if she knew exactly what I was thinking, and I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. "Everything all right?" she asked softly, her voice low and warm. I nodded, not trusting my voice to speak. There was something about the way she looked at me that left me speechless, my mind racing with thoughts I wasn't ready to confront. She smiled, that knowing smile that always made me feel like she could see through me, like she could read my every thought. And for the first time, I wondered if she could. The tension between us grew as the evening went on, the air thick with unspoken words and hidden feelings. I could feel her presence beside me, even as we sat in silence. Every movement she made seemed deliberate, as if she was acutely aware of me, of how close we were. I couldn't escape the growing sense that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. The days after that evening in the living room felt like they stretched on forever. The silence between Amanda and me had grown heavier, more palpable. We both seemed to be walking around each other, carefully avoiding the topic that neither of us dared to mention aloud. But I could feel it, lurking just beneath the surface, this new, unspoken connection between us. The following weekend, Amanda invited me over to her apartment. It wasn't unusual for us to hang out together, especially since we had often enjoyed quiet afternoons in the past. But this time, there was something different in the way she had asked me. Her voice was softer, almost inviting, and when I arrived, there was a look in her eyes, something I couldn't quite place, but it made my heart race just a little faster. We settled into the living room, the dim light of the lamps casting soft shadows on the walls. Amanda was dressed casually, but even in a simple blouse and jeans, she looked striking. Her presence seemed to fill the entire room, and I found myself unable to look away as she moved gracefully across the space. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she knew exactly what effect she was having on me. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, her voice smooth and inviting, the air thick with something unspoken. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I could manage to say anything coherent. My mind was too distracted by the way her body seemed to sway with every step, how her scent lingered in the room like a subtle, intoxicating perfume. She returned with 2 glasses of wine, and as she handed me one, our fingers brushed ever so slightly. It was a touch that sent a jolt through me, a spark I couldn't ignore. We sat down on the couch, the distance between us barely a few inches. I could feel the heat of her body next to mine, and for a moment, I wondered if she felt it too. There was no turning back now. Everything that had been building up over the past few weeks was coming to a head, and I didn't know if I was ready for it, or if I ever could be. Amanda spoke again, her voice softer than before, almost a whisper. "It's been a long time since we've spent time like this, just the two of us." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I glanced at her, catching her gaze. There was something in her eyes that was different this time. No longer was it just the warmth and kindness I had always known. It was something deeper, something that seemed to say she knew exactly what was happening between us. My pulse quickened as she leaned in closer, her shoulder brushing against mine. I didn't move away. I couldn't. The desire to pull back, to act like everything was normal, was gone. The chemistry between us was undeniable, and with each passing second, it felt like the distance between us was shrinking. For a long moment, we sat there in silence, the only sound the soft clink of our glasses as we set them down on the coffee table. The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with an energy that neither of us dared to acknowledge directly. Amanda turned to face me, her eyes meeting mine with a gaze so intense that it sent a shiver down my spine. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on my knee, sending a wave of heat through my body. I froze for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't pull away. Something in her touch felt both familiar and foreign, and the longer it lingered, the more I realized how much I wanted it. Her hand slowly moved up my leg, and I felt the intensity of the moment grow with each inch. I swallowed hard, unsure of what was happening, but unable to stop it. It was as if my body had taken control, responding to her touch without any input from my mind. She was playing me like an instrument, and I was powerless to resist. "You're so much like him," Amanda murmured, her voice barely audible. Her fingers continued their slow journey up my leg, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I didn't know who she was talking about, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the undeniable tension between us. My body was betraying me, reacting in ways I couldn't explain. I had always admired Amanda, but this was something different. This wasn't just admiration. This was desire. Her hand finally came to rest on my thigh, her fingers lightly pressing against the fabric of my jeans. I could feel the heat of her touch through the fabric, and I knew that if I let it continue, there would be no going back. Part of me wanted to stop her, to put an end to the madness before it went too far. But the other part, the part that had been craving her attention for so long, urged me to stay. The moment felt suspended in time. For the first time, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. Was I the nephew who looked up to his aunt? Or was I someone else entirely? And more importantly, Was Amanda still the Anne I had always known, or had something else started to emerge between us? Something far darker and more intimate? The days that followed that evening were filled with a strange heaviness, a weight in the air that neither of us acknowledged but both knew was there. Every interaction with Amanda felt charged with something unspoken. I could feel her presence in the room, even when she wasn't physically close, and the lingering touch of her hand on my leg haunted me. It was as though something had been set in motion that couldn't be stopped, yet neither of us dared to face it directly. Time seemed to move more slowly as I tried to go about my daily life. I would find myself lost in thought, replaying the moment in my mind, questioning what had truly happened. But the more I thought about it, the more it became clear it wasn't just a one-time slip. What I had felt that night, the intensity of it, was not something that could be brushed off. It was too real, too raw to ignore. I began noticing things about Amanda that I had never paid attention to before. There were small gestures, the way she would subtly touch me or position herself just a little too close when we were in a room together. Her eyes would linger a fraction of a second longer than necessary, a silent invitation that sent a jolt through me every time. It was like she was testing me, pushing the boundaries without ever crossing the line completely. And I, like a fool, kept responding. The connection between us grew stronger, more undeniable with each passing day. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. I could feel the pull of it every time she entered the room, the air between us thick with a tension that neither of us wanted to acknowledge, but both of us felt. The moments when we were alone together were the worst. Those fleeting, stolen seconds where time seemed to stretch and the world outside ceased to exist. I began to see Amanda in a new light, one that I had never allowed myself to see her through before. The once simple admiration I had felt for her had shifted into something darker, something more dangerous. The way she carried herself, the way she smiled, the way she moved, everything about her now seemed to call to me in a way that made my heart race. There were times when I couldn't control my thoughts, when my mind wandered to places I knew it shouldn't. I would catch myself imagining what it would be like to cross that line, to give in to the temptation that had been slowly building between us. But those thoughts were always followed by guilt, a crushing weight of shame that would make me recoil in horror. How could I even consider it? She was my aunt. She was family. And yet, despite all the reasons not to, I couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop craving the connection that had begun to form between us. It wasn't long before the tension between us reached a breaking point. One evening, I found myself alone at Amanda's apartment again. She had invited me over, just like before, but this time there was something different in the air. There was no longer the pretense of casual conversation or innocent closeness. It felt as though we were both standing on the edge of something, and neither of us was willing to back away from it. She was sitting on the couch, her legs curled underneath her, her eyes fixed on the TV screen in front of her. But I couldn't concentrate on the show. I couldn't concentrate on anything except her. I watched the way her body shifted as she adjusted her position, the way the soft fabric of her dress clung to her curves. Everything about her seemed to scream at me, and I was helpless to ignore it. I sat on the armchair across from her, my mind racing. Every time I glanced at her, my pulse quickened. I knew what was happening. I knew what we were both doing, even if we weren't saying it aloud. We were edging closer to a point where there would be no turning back, and neither of us was willing to stop. The air between us seemed to hum with anticipation, and I could feel the heat of her presence even from across the room. As the evening wore on, Amanda shifted closer to me, her body language changing from casual to something far more deliberate. She sat beside me, the space between us narrowing with every passing moment. I could feel the warmth of her body radiating against mine, and I couldn't stop myself from responding. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the desire building inside of me, a fire I couldn't extinguish. The moment seemed to stretch, to hang in the air like a storm cloud, and then, finally, something shifted. I felt her hand brush against mine, light but deliberate, and in that instant I knew. I knew that we had crossed a line. There was no going back now. The guilt that had been hanging over me, The internal battle that had been raging in my mind suddenly felt distant. All that mattered in that moment was the pull between us, the connection that had grown stronger with each passing day. I no longer cared about the consequences, about the wrongness of it all. All I could think about was the way her touch made me feel, the way my body responded to her presence. Amanda's hand lingered on mine for a moment, and then she pulled away, as if giving me a chance to back out. But I didn't. I couldn't. The temptation was too great, the desire too powerful to ignore. I leaned in, closing the distance between us, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel what had been building inside me for so long. The silence in the room was suffocating, thick with tension and unspoken desires that had finally broken free. I felt Amanda's breath on my skin as I moved closer to her, my mind spinning with the realization of what was happening. There was no turning back now. Our bodies were drawn to each other as though magnetized, and in that moment, everything else ceased to exist. But then, an unexpected sound shattered the fragile bubble that had formed around us. A door creaked open, the sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. My heart stopped. Amanda stiffened beside me, her body going rigid as her eyes flickered toward the door. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. The moment had been so real, so consuming, that I hadn't even heard anyone approaching. And now, with that one sound, everything that had been building between us felt like it was slipping through my fingers. I quickly pulled away, my body betraying me with the rapid beat of my heart. I tried to steady my breath, to force myself to think clearly, but all I could hear was the thudding of my pulse in my ears. My eyes darted nervously around the room, searching for any sign of who had entered. Amanda, too, seemed frozen, her eyes wide with panic as she stood up, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to regain composure. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but the words didn't come. All that remained was the oppressive weight of the moment, the realization that we had been caught. I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps drawing closer, followed by a soft cough, a clearing of the throat. It wasn't just anyone. It was my mother. She stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock as she took in the scene in front of her. The words hung in the air between us, unspoken but loud in their presence. I couldn't look away. I couldn't speak. My mother's gaze shifted from me to Amanda, and for a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. The weight of her stare was unbearable, and I could feel the ground beneath me shift, my world tilting as I tried to process what had just happened. Amanda was the first to break the silence, her voice a fragile whisper. But I couldn't hear her words over the rush of blood in my ears. The shock, the disbelief flooded my mind, clouding everything around me. For what felt like an eternity, my mother remained silent, her eyes never leaving us. There was nothing to say, nothing to explain. It didn't matter. The truth was now clear, and in that moment, the facade that had been built between us was shattered. There was no denying what had been happening, what had been building between Amanda and me. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood there, unable to move, unable to speak. Amanda looked just as frozen, her face pale, her body tense as she seemed to search for the right words, words that didn't exist, words that couldn't undo what had been done. Finally, my mother's lips parted, and her voice came out as a low, tremulous whisper. "What is this?" The words were soft, but the force behind them felt like a punch to my gut. I wanted to say something. I wanted to explain, to apologize, to tell her that I didn't know how we had gotten here, how it had all gone so wrong. But the truth was, I didn't have the answers. I didn't even know how to make sense of what had happened. Amanda opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at me with wide eyes, as if asking me for help, for something, anything, to make the situation less real. But there was nothing I could do. The damage had already been done. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. I could feel my mother's gaze on me, burning into me, and for the first time, I felt completely exposed. The walls that had separated us from the world, from the truth, had crumbled, leaving nothing but the rawness of the situation hanging in the air. There was no hiding from it anymore. I saw Amanda take a slow step back, her hands trembling as she tried to regain her composure. But it was clear that the weight of what had just been revealed was too much for her to bear. She couldn't face my mother. She couldn't face the truth of what had happened. And I couldn't bear to face her. There was a long pause before my mother finally spoke again, her voice low and cold, carrying a weight of finality. "Leave," she said simply. The word was like a slap, and it cut through the air with the force of a truth that could not be ignored. Amanda didn't protest. She didn't say a word. She simply nodded, the movement slow and deliberate, before turning and walking out of the room. My eyes followed her, watching as she disappeared down the hallway, leaving me standing there with the echoes of her absence filling the space between my mother and me. When she was gone, when the door had clicked shut behind her, the silence that followed was deafening. My mother stood there, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made me feel smaller than I ever had before. The house felt different now, empty, cold. A silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating, filled with the weight of everything unsaid. My mother's gaze, sharp and unforgiving, lingered in my mind, a reminder of the truth that had been laid bare, of everything that had gone wrong. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating me with the enormity of the situation. The very air in the house was heavy, as if the house itself was grieving the destruction that had just unfolded within it. After Amanda had left, it was as if time itself had stopped. There was no noise in the house, no movement except for the distant ticking of the clock on the wall. It was as though the world had paused to take in the magnitude of what had just happened. I wanted to reach out, to say something, anything, to my mother, but there was nothing left to say. She had already seen everything. There was no need for words. The truth was inescapable, and with it came the silence that would never be broken. I stood in the middle of the living room, my body frozen in place. The guilt that had been growing inside me now felt like a physical weight, pressing down on me with every passing second. It was as if my body was betraying me, carrying the burden of something I had never meant to happen, but had allowed to unfold anyway. My mind raced, but my thoughts were too jumbled, too tangled to make sense of anything. What had I done? How had it come to this? I wanted to ask my mother for forgiveness, to beg for her understanding, but I knew that it wouldn't matter. There was no redemption for what I had done. The line I had crossed with Amanda was far too great, and the damage had already been done. There was no going back. I went upstairs slowly, mechanically, my legs heavy beneath me. The house felt foreign now, each step echoing in the empty spaces. The room I had spent so many years in suddenly felt alien. The walls seemed to close in on me as I packed my things, each movement robotic, as though I was detached from the world around me. I moved without thinking, without feeling. It was the only way to get through it. As I packed, my mind kept returning to Amanda. The way she had walked out without a word, the way her eyes had met mine for that brief, unbearable moment. I could still see the resignation in her expression, the understanding that we had both lost something, something irretrievable. She was gone now, but her absence was louder than any words could ever be. I didn't know where she had gone, what she was doing, or if she was ever coming back. All I knew was that whatever we had shared was now over, and there was no repairing it. I tried to push the thoughts of her from my mind, but they were relentless. They haunted me as I shoved my clothes into a suitcase, as I gathered the last remnants of my life in that room. The images of her, her touch, her smile, the warmth of her presence, burned into my mind. I didn't know if I was trying to forget her or hold on to the memory of what we had lost. In the end, it didn't matter. What we had was gone, and nothing could bring it back. When I was finished, I stood there in the doorway of my room, looking around at the familiar space that had once been mine. It felt hollow now. The memories that had once filled that room now seemed like echoes from a different time, from a different life. The person I had been before all of this, no longer existed. The boy who had looked up to his aunt with admiration, who had seen her as a mentor and role model, was gone. In his place was someone I didn't recognize, someone who had destroyed everything in pursuit of something he couldn't even define. I walked downstairs, my steps slow and deliberate. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat a reminder of the chaos I had created. The house was still eerily silent, and I could hear my mother moving through the kitchen, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The sound of running water from the sink seemed oddly out of place, as though life had continued without me. But I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. We had crossed a line, and that line had torn us apart. I entered the kitchen and saw my mother standing at the sink, her back to me. She hadn't looked up when I entered. She hadn't acknowledged me at all. It was as though I no longer existed in her world. My presence no longer mattered to her. She continued to wash the dishes, her movements automatic, like she was trying to drown out the weight of everything that had just happened. The sound of the water running was the only thing that filled the space, drowning out the silence between us. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice hollow, lacking any emotion. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like I wasn't the one saying them, like they were coming from someone else. She didn't respond. She didn't look up. Her hands continued to move through the water, scrubbing the plates, her face expressionless. The silence between us stretched on, heavy and suffocating. There was nothing left to say. I didn't need her permission. I didn't need her approval. I just needed to leave. I turned and made my way to the door, my heart heavy in my chest. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I was going to do. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. There was nothing for me here. When I stepped outside, the cool air hit me like a slap in the face. It did nothing to ease the burn in my chest, the ache that had settled deep within me. I had lost everything, my family, my home, and the person I had once been. I didn't know where to go, didn't know what was left for me. But I couldn't stay. The world felt like it was spinning out of control, and I was caught in the middle of it, unable to find my way out. I walked down the street, the weight of my actions pressing down on me with each step. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to return to. What had been shattered could never be repaired. And with that final thought, I disappeared into the night, leaving behind the life I had once known, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again.